And hello again. We're back to When the Legends Die. We're on section 4, the final section, the mountains, where Thomas is returning back home. In his mind, he's going back home to heal up, to get himself ready again for the rodeo, getting back to the rodeos. But it's going to soon find out that he's got a lot more to get himself back to health besides just physical. And we're on page 177, chapter 42. He was the only passenger for Pagosa. The bus stopped, he got off, and the bus roared and went on towards Bayfield and Durango. He stood for a long minute looking up and down the street, which wound around the valley with its shops and stores on only the one side, facing the sharp slope at the foot which flowed into the San Juan. It was a tumbling mountain stream here, but not really a river. It didn't become a river until it was joined by the Piedra, down by Arbolas at the southern edge of the reservation, and began to canyon its way into New Mexico. He looked up and down the street, wondering why he had come. It was only vaguely familiar, like a place in a long-forgotten dream. Just that there we go. It wasn't home, but he had to come someplace. He picked up his clothes bag and walked up the street, limping slightly. He was stiff and full of dull aches from the long ride in the bus. He wondered if he should have stayed another week in Denver. Shrugged and dismissed that thought. 4 days had been long enough. 4 days to recover from the train ride. He couldn't afford to stay in Denver even if he wanted to. Because remember, he's bound to basically nothing. That's how much money it costs for his health care. And remember, he said he never saved money. He looked for a restaurant, saw the sign, and mentally corrected himself. The cafe. He went in, set his clothes back against a wall, hung his hat in the peg above it, and chose a stool at the counter, well away from the 4 men already there. The waitress, middle-aged, plain, friendly with obvious aching feet, brought a glass of water and a menu. He glanced at the menu, ordered coffee and a hot roast beef sandwich. She started towards the kitchen, and he called her back and said, "Cancel the sandwich. Make it a bowl of chili." She gave the order and brought a spoon and a paper napkin, and he glanced down at the counter with the other 4 men. They were watching him. All were in Levi's and work clothes, and he was conscious of his own clothes. The tan sports jacket, the brown striped shirt, the tailored gabardines, the fancy stitched boots. For years he had been stared at on the streets in hotels and restaurants. It hadn't mattered. It was part of being what he was. Now he felt self-conscious. The waitress brought his chili, pushed a bowl of oyster crackers towards him, and the big shaker coarsely ground red chili peppers. She brought his coffee and asked, "Coming from the east?" He nodded. "The washout all fixed up at the canyon?" "All fixed." "Well, there's a long detour between Bayfield and Durango." "Well, I'm not going any farther," he smiled at her. "I'm here." "Oh, I used to live around here." Unconsciously, he was trying to make contact with somebody, something. "You come back for a visit?" "Well, I might stay for a while." "Oh, there's worse places." And she smiled and moved down the counter. The chili wasn't very good. Too bland even when they doctored it with the ground peppers. He tasted the coffee. Restaurant coffee, oh no, cafe coffee. But he drank it and ate the chili. The waitress came back and he ordered more coffee and some lemon pie. It was cafe pie, too. He finished and went to the desk, and the waitress came to take his money. "Is it all right if I leave my clothes bag here a while?" he asked. "Nobody will bother it." He put on his hat and went out in the street again. 2 men, Indians, were sitting in the curb in front of the hardware store. One glanced up, stared at him for a moment. He glanced at them and walked on past, before he thought that the one who looked up was someone he knew. He reached back and finally found a name. Luther. But Luther who? He glanced over his shoulder. They were both watching him, saying something about him to each other. And the name came. Luther Spotted Dog. His one-time roommate, the boy he had thrown out of the room with all his gear and later had beaten up in that fight in the cow barn. Luther Spotted Dog, in worn, dirty Levi's, looking like a Skid Row character. He went on, came to a market. Thatcher's Market, the sign said. Thatcher. Then he remembered. He stared through the big window. The place was all changed. A market now, not just a store. And another memory came back of a boy and a bear cub and a crowd of men here in the street. Right here, the men threatening to kill the cub. And Jim Thatcher coming out and warning them to leave the 2 alone, both the boy and the cub. He was tempted to go in to see if Jim Thatcher was still there. Probably not. It was a long time ago. Even if he was there, Jim Thatcher probably wouldn't remember. What would it matter if he did? Tom turned away, went up the street, then came back. Luther Spotted Dog and the other man were gone. He crossed the street to a bench, started to sit down, then went on down the slope a little way towards the stream, and sat down on the ground. A startled magpie flew squawking from a nearby aspen, long-tailed and strikingly black and white. He watched the water glinting in the sun as it splashed along its rocky bed. He had wondered all the way from Denver to Wolf Creek Pass what it would be like. Then as the road wound steeply down from the pass through the pines and the aspens, the smells began to touch the quick of his being. The resinous pine smell, the damp wood smell, the clean smell of fast water. It was almost painful, the way it cut down through the layers of the ears. He finally had to close his eyes and make himself aware of the bus smells to ease it, the odors of people and dust and hot oil and exhaust fumes. Then the bus began to pass small ranches and stream-like fishing camps and cabins, and he could look again and smell again. Now sitting here in the sun, watching the flashing stream, he found himself blocking out the sounds and smells of the street behind him. He sat there half an hour, then decided he'd better find some place to stay. A cheap room somewhere. But first he had to get some other clothes. And these looked like a millionaire dude. There weren't any cheap rooms for everybody dressed like this. He went back across the street to the clothing store. A clerk dressed like New York or Chicago greeted him and Tom and said, "I need some work clothes." The clerk looked him over, head to foot, and asked, "Well, what do you have in mind?" "Levi's." The clerk led him to a counter and showed him a pair of tight-cut, fancy-stitched denim pants, and Tom shook his head. "Work clothes," he repeated, then glanced at himself. "I got the dude kind," he said with a smile. Another man came in, a man with dusty Levi's and a black hat mottled with sweat stains, and he stood at the desk while the clerk took Tom towards the back of the store to a pile of folded Levi's cut for ease, not for style. He chose a pair in Tom's size and held them up, and Tom nodded. "Oh, and a couple of shirts and a brush jacket." The clerk asked his shirt size, brought the blue work shirts and a short denim jacket. Tom tried it on, asked for more shoulder room, and then asked, "Have you got a place where I can change?" The clerk took him to a fitting room, and Tom put on his work clothes. Then he came out and told the clerk he wanted a pair of plain work boots. When he was fitting the boots, the clerk asked, "Were you staying around here?" It was a conversational question. "I used to live around here." Then with a smile, "I used to herd sheep over near Bayfield." The clerk chuckled. It was a joke, but he would go along with it. The dress boots Tom had just taken off cost $85 a pair, and the clerk knew it. And the mohair jacket must have cost at least $100. They went back to the desk and carefully folded the mohair jacket, gabardine slacks, the striped shirt, and packed them with the spare blue work shirt in a box. He wrapped the $85 boots, and Tom paid his bill and turned to leave. The man who had come with him while Tom was choosing Levi said, "Did I hear you say you used to herd sheep?" "That's right," Tom smiled, sharing the joke with him. "You wouldn't know where I could find a good herder, would you?" Tom shook his head. Then, following the same impulse that made him talk to the waitress, he said, "Well, what do you need a herder for at this time of year? Your flocks must all be out in the grass by now." "Well, they are. They're up in summer range, but I lost a herder last week. Damn fool shot himself in the foot. Had gangrene when my supply man found him. He might lose his leg." "Well, where's this flock?" "On the Piedra, up on Horse Mountain." "Oh, there's good grass up there. Used to be, anyway." "Still is. You know that country?" "I've been there." "Your face is familiar. Do I know you? My name's Jim Woodward." "I'm Tom Blackbull." Remember, he has not called himself that for years, if ever. He said the name without thinking. Woodward shook his head. "No, I guess not." He turned towards the clerk. "Do you know a herder looking for a job, Henry?" Tom left them, went out and started down the street. Then on impulse, he turned back and met Jim Woodward as he was leaving the store. "Hey, I'll take the flock for you," Tom said. "What?" Jim Woodward stared at him unbelieving. Then he asked, "You mean that?" "Yes." "Well, I'll be damned," Woodward laughed. "In a cafe not a little while ago, I said you were probably an actor from that movie you crowd over at Durango. If you don't mind my asking, what do you want to herd sheep for? The job is yours, but I'm just plain damn curious." "Oh, I've been laid up for a while, sick. I want to get out in the hills doing something that's not too hard work for a while." "Well, how soon can you go?" "Well, any time. Right now." "Well, come on. I've got a man from the home ranch up there holding the flock, but I need him in the hayfield. Throw your things in the pickup over there while I get a couple boxes of 30-30 shells, and I'll be right with you." So, you got Tom. He's back home. He's referring himself back to Tom Blackbull. And the man mentions it's up on Horse Mountain. Remember, that's the mountain where Tom grew up. And Tom just goes, "I've been there." All right, chapter 43, page 181. They headed west on the highway. Woodward asked him a few questions, and Tom gave short answers. I've been back east. A broken leg, but they pinned it and it's all right to walk on, the doctor says. I'm Ute, not Navajo. Tom asked questions, and Woodward said the home ranch was in the San Luis Valley, over by Antonito. He ran 12 to 15,000 head of sheep, parceled the mountain flocks at 2,000 head or so, and sent them into the high country for summer range. Fed out his own lambs in the fall, wintered his ewes on the home ranch, and he had 3 flocks between Pagosa and Durango. I trail them out to summer range back in the fall. My supply man makes the rounds once a week. If a good herder wants to stay on, I've got work for him at the home ranch all winter. You know, that horse mountain country you'll make out. Only for God's sake, if you got to shoot yourself, do it in the head and make a clean job of it. Woodward laughed wryly. God, how gangrene stinks, just like a fly-blown sheep carcass. At Piedra Town, they turned north up the river and into the hills, following a track that couldn't even be called a wagon trail. Woodward was so busy driving he had no time to talk. The track crossed the shallow Piedra half a dozen times and zigzagged up the valley, much of the way slow going for the pickup. Remembering his own trips up and down the valley long ago, Tom thought they made incredibly fast time. Before he could believe it, they were at the foot of Horse Mountain, making their way around it. Then they climbed a sharp slope, topping out on a flat shoulder, and came to a big natural meadow edged half a mile away by aspens and scattered pines. The flock was grazing at the far edge just this side of the timber. The herder wasn't in sight, but a saddled horse had lifted its herd from grazing and watched them. Woodward drove past a gray pyramid tent beside a small creek and gave it a nod, and drove slowly out towards the meadow towards the sheep. The man got to his feet and waved, and 2 dogs barked. The man walked towards them, and Woodward drew up beside him. "Dave!" Woodward shouted above the roar of the motor. "This is Tom. He's going to take the flock. Come on in and show him what things are, and we'll head for home." Now, Dave nodded to Tom. He was a tall, sinewy farm boy in his late 20s. He went to catch up the saddle horse, and Woodward drove slowly along the edge of the flock, appraising, and then turned and drove back to the tent. They got out, and Tom saw that Dave kept a neat camp. The Dutch oven beside the flat stones of the cooking fireplace was clean, coffee pot was airing, and the skillet had been scoured. Dave rode up, the dogs with them, and showed Tom the tin-covered grub box, the cooler in the creek with the meat and the butter, the kerosene can for the lantern. He flipped open the tent flaps, pointed to the blankets neatly drawn up on the folding canvas cot. "No bugs. Anything I hate is a lousy bed. I finally got them all cleaned out." He turned to the dogs. "Shep and Spot know the hand signals. Good dogs. And old Mac?" He, nodding towards the bay gelding. "He's a lazy old plug, but he doesn't wander. You don't have to hobble him." Woodward was getting restless. He handed Tom his clothes bag from the pickup, then picked up the box of 30-30 shells. "Almost forgot these. You may need them." Dave nodded. "Well, there's a bear or 2 around. I haven't seen one, but Manuel said he did. The rifle's in a saddle boot. She's sighted in at 100 yards and shoots good and flat." He, too, was eager to be off. "Well, that about covers things." Tom said, "I think so." Dave and Woodward got into the truck. "Anything comes up, ask Charlie the supply man. He'll be around Thursday," Woodward added. "Or is it Wednesday up here, Dave?" "That's Thursday." Woodward was gunning the motor. "Well, good luck," and Dave shouted as Woodward swung the pickup around and headed towards the valley. Tom watched them go out of sight, heard the motor a few minutes later, then stood and listened to the silence. It was unbelievable. He had forgotten. They heard the burbling of the creek, the whispers of the aspens just across the creek, but those sounds were like a part of the silence, the peace. One of the dogs nosed his hand, and he rubbed its ear, then looked at the flock, began to loosen up, scattered on the edge of the timber. He ordered the dogs to pull the flock together, but they were baffled by his words. Without thinking, he remembered the hand signals Albert Left Hand used, and made them, and the dogs raced across the meadow towards the sheep. He looked at the saddle horse, was tempted to mount and follow the dogs, but decided against riding. He walked, leading the horse, and the grass underfoot felt strangely soft. It had been a long time since he had walked on grass. His legs were stiff and his hips were sore from the pickup ride, but he walked all the way to the flock. The dogs had pulled him together again. He looped the reins loosely over the saddle horn, let the horse graze, and sat down to rest. He was breathing fast. He wasn't used to the thin air. It would take a few days to get acclimated again. He sat, savoring the pine-scented air, resting his eyes on the nearby green, the distant blue. They looked at his Levi's, still doing stiff, and at the plain work boots. He knew he was an outlander, a stranger. He heard lambs bleating for their mothers, even blatting their answers, and he smiled at the irony. He had come west to rest and start over, but he hadn't expected to go all the way back to his beginnings. He was a sheepherder again, right back where he started. He plucked a blade of grass and chewed it and washed the sheep and welcomed the warmth of the sun on his back. Mid-afternoon passed, and the sun began to slip down towards the peaks to the west. The sheep were working their back across the meadow towards the creek. When the long shadows reached him, he caught the horse, reached for the stirrup, and swung into the saddle without thinking. Then he felt a twinge in his right leg and an ache across his hips, but there was no real pain. He reined the horse around towards the sheep, thinking it had been almost 2 months since he had been in the saddle. Years since he had been on a gentle horse. He rode along the edge of the creek, taking the horse for a walk and following the sheep towards the creek. They took their time, and when they reached the water, they scattered along it and drank their fill, then turned back into the grass. They would graze for another hour until late dusk before they bedded down. He rode over to his camp, unsaddled the horse, and hung the saddle from a rope over a low branch of a pine near the tent to keep him out of reach of porcupines. He built a fire, opened a can of beans, and set them to heat in the frying pan, and made a pot of coffee. By the time he had eaten and fed the dogs, the sheep had bedded down, and the first stars were out. He washed his dishes and put them away, then went with the dogs for a slow walk around the flock. The stars glinted, the air was cool, and the aspens whispered in the night. The sheep were quiet. He went back to the fire, poured another tin cup of coffee, and sat sipping it, watching the embers darken and die. He sat for another half hour before the chill deepened the aches in his tired muscles and complaining joints. He got up, attempted to bring out a blanket and roll it up under the stars, the night close around him, but he knew that was foolish. He went into the tent, undressed in the dark, got into bed, and was asleep in 5 minutes. It was dawn when he wakened. He pushed back the blankets, put his pants and boots, and went outside. The dog, sleeping, curled up beside the stones of the fireplace, stretched out and yawned and whined a greeting. He went to the creek, washed in the icy water, and noticed the night's dew dripping from the bushes. He had forgotten how wet everything was in a mountain dawn, how chilly. He filled the coffee pot and built a fire and set bacon to fry. The sheep had begun to leave their bed ground. They would graze contentedly where they sat for another hour. He had a first cup of coffee, then he mixed batter and fried pancakes in the bacon grease. He fed the dogs and ate his own breakfast, and the sun came up over the range to the east and shimmered the morning mist that hung over the meadow. Jays began to scream, and one came close to the fire, expecting a handout. He tossed it a piece of pancake. A long-tailed magpie scolded, but didn't come near. He fried the last of the batter in one big cake and flipped it out of the stones to cool for the birds and chipmunks. When he had washed his dishes, he got the packet of stew meat from the cooler and set it to cook with onions and potatoes in the Dutch oven. By the time he had made his bed, old Mac came up expecting to be saddled, and Tom obliged him, mounted, called the dogs, they went out to gather the sheep, which had scattered all over the meadow. Once they were bunched, he rode a slow circle of the meadow, orientating himself. He couldn't remember ever being here, this particular meadow, though he was sure he had been in the valley just below. On the way up to the pickup, he had seen a dozen places that looked familiar, but distances were distorted. The pickup was pickup that as slow as traveling 2 or 3 times as fast as a man would be on foot. He was sure there were other places he would recognize once he let the layers of time slip off. Time, he thought, was like the onions he had just peeled. Layer on layer, and to get down to the heart of things, you had the layers peel off one by one. He circled the meadow, finding hidden gaps among the trees that led to other smaller meadows, which he marked in his mind to graze where the sheep had grazed down the big meadow. Then he came to a place where the timbered slope fell away steeply, and a wide vista opened to the north and the west. The mountains stood in deceptive ranks, scattered but looking like successive ranges, each with their own degree of shadow and distance. 2 peaks well apart loomed against the others, the gray bulk of one perhaps 15 miles to the northwest, the bald upthrust of the others half again as far directly north. He smiled, recognizing them. Granite Peak, the closer one, to the northwest, and Bald Mountain to the south, to the north. He sat in the saddle a long time, just looking. Then he rode back to the flock, sat in the grass, and let the horse graze, and felt another layer of time slowly peeling off. Noon, the sun overhead, he walked back to camp and ate a plate full of stew. And all afternoon he sat in the sun or watched, and then let the peace of the silence soak into him. Evening and supper, and a last walk around the bedded flock. Eat and sleep and walk, Dr. Ferguson had ordered. Remembering, he smiled. There wasn't much else for a sheepherder to do, even if he wanted to. Okay, next we're at chapter 44, page 186. Charlie the supplies man came on schedule. He was wiry, curly-haired in his late 30s. He was talkative, full of gossip and stories, profane, vulgar, and friendly. He stayed almost an hour, cursing the rocks of the difficult trail, talking of women and liquor. He said Manuel, the herder who shot himself in the foot, had been operated on. They took his leg off right up to the knee, the poor bastard. I'll have a hell of a time chasing the women now. But the curses, the women talk, even the sympathy from Manuel were conversational, nothing more. At last he asked, got any problems that I should report to the boss? And Tom shook his head. We'll see you next week, Charlie said. He got back in the truck and went back the way he had come. Tom put the fresh meat and the butter into the cooler, stowed the groceries, and was glad to be alone. But that night, he dreamed about Blue Elk. The old man came to him from his dreams with his derby hat and his well-oiled braids and his squeaky shoes and his incessant talk. The old songs have been sung, Blue Elk said. The old ways are gone. But in the dream, Tom is no longer a boy. He's a man, come back after the long years. But Blue Elk talked as though he was still a boy. You must learn the new ways, Blue Elk said. You must learn to read the white man's readings and write his writing. You must learn to plow and plant the field as he does. And Tom asked, did you learn to plow and plant, Blue Elk? Did you learn to read and write? I'm an old man, Blue Elk said. I speak for your own good. Tom said, I learned. Don't you know who I am, Blue Elk? I am Devil Tom Black, the killer. I killed you, Blue Elk, and I killed Benny Grayback and the others. I would have killed Red Dillon, but he killed himself. Do you know that, Blue Elk? And the man in front of him wasn't Blue Elk at all. It was Red Dillon, and Red was laughing at him. When you feel that way, Red said, don't try to take it out on me. Take it out on the horses where you got a chance. I took it out on the horses, Tom cried. And Red laughed at him and tilted a bottle and drank and wiped the bottle on his sleeve, offered it to Tom. Tom took a swallow and his head reeled, and Red was gone and there was Blue Elk again. And Tom was a boy chanting the old songs, a song long forgotten of the rhythm and the water rhythm and the rhythm of the days and the seasons. He chanted and Blue Elk began to sway in the white man's high-backed chair, to sway and to chant, humming the words he couldn't remember. His voice rose in a mournful pitch, a howl that swelled and faded and swelled again. Tom wakened, roused by his own voice and the howling. After a moment he knew he had been dreaming. The light of the late moon shone through the tent with dull radiance, and one of the dogs was howling just outside. Tom got up, flung back the tent flap, and spoke sharply to the dog. It wagged its tail, cringing at his voice, and came low-bellied to him and licked his hand. He rubbed its ears and spoke to it and went back and curled up beside the fireplace. He went back to bed and after a time to untroubled sleep. The next morning he went naked to the creek and bathed in the icy water. As he got out and rubbed warmth in his legs and body, he wondered why he had done it. It was sheer punishment to bathe in the creek at dawn. He usually took his bath in late afternoon when the air was warm. But when he hurried back and got into his clothes, he felt the glow all over his body. He was glad he had done it. He built a fire, cooked his breakfast, and set the camp in order. Then he saddled the horse and rode out to the flock, remembering the dream and the howling dog. He knew why he had that dream. The supply man reminded him of Red. And thinking of Red, he had thought back to Blue Elk. Nothing mysterious about that. He rode out to the flock, and he walked and sat in the sun, and came in for the noon meal, and went back and told himself it was just another day of waiting. Getting paid for waiting and healing himself, he was ready to get back to the arena. Then he smelled the smells of the arena, heard the sounds. He felt the remembered jolt of a bronc as it lunged out of the chute. He sensed the pattern, lunge, 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 half spin, side jump, lunge, lunge, lunge again. And he caught himself. He had made that ride in the big roan of the garden plenty of times. No need to go over that again. He stretched his right leg, tensed his thigh, felt the soreness still there. Not much, but some. He got to his feet, walked on the edge of the flock. He still had a slight limp. He was entitled to that. It was as much a part of him as that stiff left shoulder. The gimps, the scars, they were the marks of his trade. He was a bronc rider. They laughed at himself. Tom Black, Killer Tom, herding sheep. Now the days passed, and the weeks marked only by the arrival of Charlie, the supply man. James came to share his breakfast each morning, and Chipmunk sat on his knee and ate crumbs from his hand at the noon meal. Then one afternoon he plucked grass stems and wove a basket half the size of his fist, his fingers remembering a forgotten skill. Having done that, he knew it was silly and childish, but he hung it in a bush where a field mouse looking for an abandoned bird's nest might find it and line it with fluff for a winter haven. He grazed the flock for a smaller meadow nearby, and coming back one evening to the bedground, he surprised two does and their 4 fawns watering the creek close by the tent. Seeing that the fawns were losing their spots, he realized how swiftly the season was passing. The sun was moving south, the day shortening, and a few mornings later he saw a white cap of snow on Pagosa Peak, far off to the northeast. Then Woodward arrived again. Tom was eating his noon meal when Woodward drove up. He got out the other tin plate and cup, poured coffee, and told Woodward to help himself to the stew. Woodward asked the expected questions about the sheep and supplies and grass. He kept watching Tom, and finally he said, "Found some rodeo pictures the other day in an old magazine." Tom went on eating, made no comment. "One bronc rider was a dead ringer for you. His name was Tom Black. Ever know him?" "Yes." "Quite a rider, I judge." "Well, that's what they say." "Whatever happened to him?" Woodward asked with a smile. "He's still around," Tom said. Woodward seemed pleased with his discovery and didn't press Tom for more information. He finished his coffee, set his plate aside. "Well, come on, let's have a look at the sheep. I'm going to move them down in another couple of weeks." They got the pickup and drove out to the flock and went slowly around them, Woodward stopping from time to look and to appraise. Let them get all the grass they can before the drive," he said. "I like to start them in good shape. I'll bring them up from the home ranch to have them move up." They drove back towards the camp, and Woodward said, "I told you when I hired you I'd keep good herders on for the winter. Do you want to stay?" "I've got other plans." Woodward smiled. "Do you think you're ready to ride again?" "Yes." "I knew when I hired you you weren't a sheep herder, but I needed a man. You seem to know sheep, and you knew this part of the country, so I took a gamble. I will say you've done a damn good job at that." Tom got out of the tent. Woodward said, "See you in a couple of weeks," and drove on back down the valley. And we're going to stop there as we go into next time, chapter 45, as we're almost done with When the Legends Die.